Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yusril, the game is World of Warships, and I am a lucky, lucky man. Like more people than would probably care to admit it, I spent a good chunk of last week playing Legion. Yes, I'm playing World of Warcraft again. Yes, I fell off the wagon, and yes, it might just be the rebound, but ooh, Legion is pretty good so far. Granted, so far is 1 week in. However, that did leave me down a video for today, and then the World of Warships Southeast Asia site published this. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the revamped Japanese destroyer line. Ooh, this could be good, and possibly a little controversial. Today's video is going to be a little bit of history, a lot of speculation, because we've got very little hard info from Wargaming at the moment, and yes, a little bit of anime. I'll give you advance warning when we get there. Basics first, tiers 2, 3 and 4 aren't changing at all. Tier 5 still has the Minikaze, tier 10 is still Shimikaze, which is all well and good, but hopefully Shimikaze is going to get a balance pass, because right now her stats are well behind the other tier 10 destroyers, and have been ever since the Great Long Lance nerf of 0.5. Everything else gets changed. Mutsuki is the first beneficiary. She's down 1 tier, tier 5 along with Minikaze, which is arguably where she should be. She's always struggled at tier 6, especially when bottom tier, but at tier 5 she'll probably find herself pitched as a longer ranged, heavier hitting but slower firing alternative to Minikaze and Kamikaze. Replacing her at tier 6 are Fubuki and Hatsuharu. This is going to be interesting from a balance standpoint. Same tier, similar speed, but at the moment Bucky is much better armed. She's got 3 triple tubes rather than 2, and 6 guns rather than 5. In real life, Hatsuharu was designed as a cheap but less effective complement to the Fubukis. However, this is World of Warships. We don't really have to worry about economics, tier 10 repair and ammo costs notwithstanding, so while Bucky will lose her stealth module more than likely, it's a tier 8 toy after all, and she'll have a detection range somewhere in the 6.7 kilometer bracket as a result, it remains to be seen if Hatsuharu will need an extra trick or two to be competitive. It's also possible that Bucky will be limited to her sea hull, which cuts her down to 4 guns, you know, the garbage hull, the one nobody ever uses at tier 8, so Hatsuharu will actually outgun her 5 to 4, while Bucky carries a bigger torpedo load. Of course, exactly what torpedo she's going to be carrying remains open for Wargaming to decide. At tier 7, we've got 2 new ships, Akatsuki and Shiratsuyu. Well, new-ish. The Shiratsuyus started life as the second half of the Hatsuharu's production run, but they were so heavily modified, most notably after the Tomazuru and 4th Fleet incidents, that they ended up as a separate class. From a gameplay standpoint, think a slightly slower Hatsuharu. They were rated for 34 knots, but with quad torpedo tubes rather than triples. 2 ships of the class are particularly notorious for utterly different reasons. The first one is Shigure, the second ship of the class. Shigure was laid down in 1933, launched in 1935, commissioned 1936, and like a lot of Japanese destroyers, she then split her time between escort duties and Tokyo Express runs to Guadalcanal. So far, so normal, but Shigure acquired a reputation as a lucky ship over the course of the war. She was the sole survivor of the Japanese ships that went into the Surigao Strait. She survived a direct bomb hit during Operation Hailstone, and even when she was eventually sunk by a torpedo from the USS Blackfin, she sank so slowly that some 270 of her 300-odd crew were able to escape. We may well see her as either a B-hull for the Shiratsuyu or a premium, because, remember I mentioned Operation Hailstone? That bomb hit forced the removal of her number 2 turret, and the replacement was a platform with extra 25mm anti-air guns, so what you get is a configuration fairly similar to the current Hatsuharu B, which gives you an opening as either a premium or a tech tree branch for the Shiratsuyus themselves. The other ship of the class. The other ship is Yodachi, who is notorious for, well, those of you who can't stand anime have about 5 seconds to mute the audio. And in 3, 2, 1, unleash.
Boy, 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 boy. Boy.
And that's enough of that. Yep, this is where the poi train comes from. Poi is a modifier that indicates uncertainty in Japanese. Probably the nearest in English would be ish as a suffix. And the Kantai collection of Yudachi has it as a verbal tick because nobody's exactly sure what happened during her final engagement at Guadalcanal. It was an extremely confused night battle. Is she likely to be a premium? No. Is she likely to infest the chat server? I'd say that's pretty much a given. The Akatsukis are a bit more complicated. Strictly speaking, they're actually Fubukis. The Fubuki was produced in 3 batches. The first 10 were done in 1928 and 1929. The second batch of 10 ships were done in 1930 and 1931. They had the anti-air capable Type B turret. That's the upgraded version we have in game at the moment. They also had some tweaks to their bridge layout, and they're sometimes considered different enough to be known as the Ayanami class. The final 4, however, had further tweaks to their torpedo launchers and, critically, their boilers. Visually, they were still very similar to the other Fubukis, and the Japanese Navy actually passed them off as Fubukis in order to conceal the tinkering. But it's these 4 ships, Akatsuki, Inazume, Ikuzuchi and Hibiki, that some historians and wargaming treat as a separate Akatsuki class, which is why the number of Fubukis built is either 10 or 24, depending on who's counting. In gameplay terms, well, think a Fubuki that does 38 knots. Much like Fubuki and Hatsuharu at Tier 6, Shiratsuyu and Akatsuki at Tier 7 are going to be an interesting balance problem. In fact, they're going to be worse. Shiratsuyu is slower, less well-armed, and possibly better handling, possibly stealthier. But Wargaming are going to need to find a very elephant way to balance the Akatsuki against Shiratsuyu, and I suspect it's going to come down to exactly what torpedoes she is allowed to load. There's another possible premium here. Hibiki survived the war. She was given to the Soviet Navy as a prize, and actually entered service with the Soviet Pacific Fleet as the Verni. She had 6 130mm guns and 6 533mm torpedo tubes, so a Japanese hull with Russian weapons might be an interesting mix. Moving on, Kagaru is now down to Tier 8, where a lot of people are saying she should have been all along. In fact, the Torpedo Ninja crowd, who often preferred Bucky's 3x3 to Kagi's 2x4, were frequently heard suggesting that Bucky should have been the Tier 9. Which is going to leave the Tier 9s as, well, potentially a massive disappointment, because the Yugamo class were essentially Kagarus with a few extra anti-air guns strapped on. They had the same 3x2 gun setup, although their guns were anti-air capable, and they had the same 2x4 quad torpedo layout, which, yeah. They may be half a knot faster, but it's very hard to see how Kagaru's balance problems aren't simply going to stay under Yugamo. Wargaming may pull a surprise here. Maybe. Last but not least, we have the Akizukis at Tier 8, and this is a massive departure for the Japanese destroyer line, because while most Japanese destroyers tend to be all about the torpedoes, Akizuki is all about the guns, to the extent that she only actually has 1 quadruple launcher, and that was an afterthought. The guns, however, the guns are the 10cm Type 98. She has 8 of them, 2 dual mounts, 4 and 2 aft. We've seen the guns and the turrets before. They're the secondary armament on the Tier 10 Zao. The gun also makes an appearance on the Tier 9 Ibuki as the secondary and heavy anti-air there. They have a reload of between 3 and 4 seconds, giving a rate of fire of 15 to 20 rounds a minute, depending on the source. Muzzle velocity, 1,000 meters per second or more. And I suspect Wargaming are going to go for the lower end of the refire rate, because 160 rounds a minute downrange at 1 kilometre a second at Tier 8, yeah, that might be a smidge overpowered. Oh, and their anti-air guns as well. On the Zao they put out about 10 DPS each. Add 8 of those, bolt on the 25mm anti-air guns. Akatsuki had 8 as she was originally built. Suzutsuki's 1945 setup, yeah, that had 47 of them. Each of those puts out about 2 DPS. Yeah, this girl could potentially put out more flack than some Japanese cruisers at the tier. It's tempting to start hyping Akatsuki as a mini Atlanta with railguns, but the Ducky's big problem is firstly going to be speed. She only makes 33 knots according to Wiki, in a tier where even the American destroyers and the Japanese cruisers make 35. And while the guns have a higher muzzle velocity, the shells are much lighter. They're only 100mm compared to 127, so their performance against armour and their downrange muzzle velocity will be open to question as well. And that's pretty much all that can be said with any certainty. Wargaming will hopefully release more stats as we get closer, and I'll be keeping a very close eye on this because the Japanese destroyers are my main line. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to work out who I need to beg and or bribe to get access to these on the test server. So until next time, farewell.